What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report's Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope all is well. A lot going on in the world. I thought I would return us to a state of geekdom. We're going to look at a little geekdom. We're going to talk a little bit about one of the things happening right now that might be of interest to you. Now, this is based off of a comic book series that I didn't read, back in the day. I mean, when it came out, I was familiar with it. I saw it on the shelves. I mean, I have a 40-year collection of comics, so it's not that I'm new to the genre by any stretch, but it didn't seem interesting to me. But I will admit, I was wrong. I should have engaged this much earlier. It deals with, really, if you take the Superman mythos and you twist it a couple things, it deals kind of with that. Like, first of all, how would people with that level of strength actually fight? What would the fights look like? How brutal would they be, right? And the other issue they raised is, what if Kryptonians, and they don't call them Kryptonians in the Invincible series, of course, but they're kind of like Kryptonians. They're advanced technologically, culturally, so on and so forth. But the difference here is everybody on Krypton, as it were, already has powers. And what if this group decided to colonize the universe? How would they act? What kind of things would take place? So Invincible is a very interesting series, an interesting comic book. But recently it became an animated series you can find on Amazon, and it just completed its first season. And it's been fairly true to the comics, except for a couple of exceptions. One of the most hated characters in the series is a black woman who was initially white in the comics, but I digress. I don't think I have the energy to get into that crap today. But anyway, this series introduces a young man who is the son of this universe's Superman, if you will. His name is Omni-Man, and his son, Mark, waits till his 18th birthday to get his superpowers, and they come. And he wants to be a superhero like his dad. And I should tell you, there will be spoilers to some extent. I'm not really going in depth on the series, even though I would say it's a good watch. You should enjoy it. You should check it out. But that aside, this is dealing with the comic. In other words, it's dealing with something that hasn't happened in the animated series yet, but it's more than likely going to, because they've been fairly consistent to the books, right? And so this particular one, I found this on a video on YouTube, and if I don't remember to, you can ask me, and I'll put the link in the description. But this series is covering the actual comic and what kind of things took place. So they call them Viltrumites in this universe, and they are this universe's version of Kryptonians, except they all have powers, and they're all basically a colonizing force across the universe, right? And in this particular comic, Mark, who has been raised human, right, doesn't know anything about his Viltrumite background, is being raped. He's being raped by a female Viltrumite that's basically tasked, as they all are, with reproducing. Mark doesn't really know this, and he has no interest in doing that. He has problems with his father's culture. He has problems with Viltrumites. He sees himself as a human. He's trying to protect Earth. So he's kind of straddling the fence in certain respects. And apparently in this comic, this woman is looking to be inseminated, if you will. And she demands it, and demands it physically. Now, I want to point out, I'm talking about this because this happens. This is not just fiction, even though people tend to think it is. But nevertheless, I'll show you a couple of clips. You can get a sense, right? Now, this particular scene is actually what happened after she violated him. But, leading up to it, they get into a big brawl. Now, Viltrumites live apparently for centuries. So he's only 18, 19 years old at this time. She's, from what I understand, she might be several centuries old. And apparently they get stronger the older they get. They age extremely slow. So, like I said, they can live for thousands of years, but they get stronger the older they get. So she kind of dominates him here. And you can see in the scenes, what that actually looks like. Right? Now, the reason I raise this is because it is important. And what it generally speaks to is the exploitation of power. Now, obviously, in a comic book, we're talking about power in the sense, that this woman is stronger. But power isn't always about physical strength. It can be situational. It can be, political. It can be employment based. There's a lot of ways that women can have power over men. So before I start to hear from a bunch of guys who will either A, talk about how much they would love to experience this, or B, talk about how no woman could ever dominate them, you really need to expand your imagination and really look at the kind of situations that happen to everyday men, right? So when you talk about rape in this regard, again, this occurs. Now, in the comic book series, there have been, recently speaking, a few characters that have experienced rape, which is something I never thought I'd see, right? Not only in the comic books, but even in some of the animated series. Like, if you look at the animated series, you have Batman and Nightwing, who used to be Robin, both of whom have been raped by female characters, right? Batman was drugged and by, oh my goodness, how am I blinking on the name? And you guys know her name too. Ra's al Ghul's daughter, Talia. She rapes him, takes his seed, and has a son. And then introduces his son years later when his son is, like 9 or 10 years old. And this is when Batman finds out he has a son. And even though we kind of sweep past the fact that she raped him and drugged him to do so, it occurred. In another series, we see Nightwing, again, who was formerly Robin. He's raped by, the Joker's ex-girlfriend. What's her name? God damn it. It's one of those days, I swear. Harley Quinn. I apologize. Anyway, so she rapes him at one point. She ties him up after she beats him up, which is interesting. And then he wakes up and, she's changing in front of him, and he has an erection, and she takes it. Now, here's the thing. Just like in this comic, that actually happens in this scene that I'm showing you here in Invincible. He has an erection despite not wanting to have sex with her. This happens to men and women. This has happened to both when being raped. And this can feel like a betrayal of your body, right? And this is something women have talked about for the longest. When a woman is raped, when she's actually getting wet, you know what I mean? Some women actually can feel like their body is turning against them. And that can be the same way with men. You can have an erection at a situation and still not want to have sex with someone. Nevertheless, the results can be what the results are here, right? Or that can be taken advantage of. And there are other ways it can be taken advantage of as well. Like one of the types of violation that can take place is sleep rape. There have been cases where women have broken into men's houses and basically climbed on top of them in the morning when they're more than likely to have an erection. And, the man wakes up mid-sex. And this can be especially problematic if she's looking to get pregnant. It can be very difficult to manage, right? And of course, most people assume it's voluntary on your part simply because you had an erection, but that actually has nothing to do with it. Another form, as I talked about with Batman, is being drugged, and this happens as well. This actually happens on college campuses too, and it's tied with alcoholism. So lately, we've gotten to the point where we will talk about the ways in which one person can take advantage of another if there's alcohol involved. But we generally only see that as it pertains to men against women. If both people are drunk, or if the man is drunk and sex takes place, there have been very few instances where we've actually seen women as aggressors, even when they were. One of those cultural dynamics where we have to move out of this Victorian notion of female innocence and really look at each situation for what it actually is. That's another way it can take place. So you got alcoholism, you got, drugs that can be used, you got sleep rape, you have coercion, right? Even blackmail, right? Where you can be blackmailed with a vicious rumor, or there can be evidence that can ruin your reputation in some kind of way. And there have been cases where women have used that to demand sex and sexual service, right? That is a violation. You can be threatened with job loss, right? By a supervisor, and I've experienced this one, where there's a demand for sex if you want to keep your job. You can also be threatened by a professor, undergrad or graduate school, and a demand for sex. I once sat in on a graduate course. It was actually my first course where one of the professors that gave the lecture, she said very explicitly that she was looking for a male who would provide her sexual service for a grade. Interesting. And she apparently had done this before. Now, it can seem like a voluntary thing, and it can be in certain circumstances. In others, it doesn't necessarily have to be a violation. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be innocent. Or, it can very much be predatory and very much a violation if it's against his will, and yet his future is being threatened, right? And there's a lot of ways that this can happen. And One of the other ways is that women can take advantage of the fact that we have a culture that, villainizes masculinity and men. There are cases like that. We see this with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, where when Johnny confronts her about recorded incidents, and she says on tape, tape, I'm dating myself, but she says on the recording, look, you can tell anybody you want what I did to you. Nobody's going to believe you. This is key. Now, what am I talking about? Basically, what I'm saying is you have power as it's seen in this comic book. I mean, the comic book defines it solely on physical terms. And that too can happen, especially if you have a large, strong woman and a very small male. That can happen. But power does not need to limit itself to physicality by any means. Power can be simply in the dynamic of the relationship or the circumstance. If you're asleep and they're awake, there's a power in the fact that they have an alertness and awareness that you do not. If you're drugged, again, they have the power of being clear-minded while you are not. Right? And that goes for alcoholism as well. If you're being blackmailed, they have a power over you based on information you may not want to get out. And the information doesn't even necessarily have to be true. It can just be enough to damage your reputation. That's still a power that someone has over you. Obviously, if they're your employer or their teacher and they hold your financial well-being, your income, or your future in regard to your grades and your access to completing your degrees and getting into academia, those things, though, they demonstrate a power that this person can have over you. And that power can take many different forms. It is not at all limited to just physical dominance. And as long as we define rape solely on those terms, it's going to be hard for us to imagine these circumstances that do occur every day and go unpunished because of our difficulty in accepting the reality that they exist. And part of the problem with this is we've been watching films, especially since the 1970s, that told us that rape was solely something that men did to women, and they did it because they were physically stronger. It's 2021. We really have to break these dynamics down and look at what actually happens on a day-to-day basis. Now, first and foremost, this is not limited to just theory. I mean, one of the things we've seen since 2012 is the FBI redefine rape. It used to define rape in terms of the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will, but they began to redefine that, and they focused more on penetration with no mention of gender or force, for that matter, right? So this definition opens itself to what's referred to as made to penetrate. This definition includes victims, male and female, who were forced to penetrate someone else with their own body parts or a foreign item, either by physical force or coercion, or when the victim was drunk or high or otherwise unable to consent. Right? When those cases were taken into account, the rates of non-consensual sexual contact basically equalized between men and women. 1.270 million women and 1.267 million men claim to be victims of sexual violence. Right? This is 2010, 2011. So the numbers began to equalize when we expanded the definition of rape to include how men experience it. See, it's not an issue of whether or not men and women experience rape. It is sometimes an issue of how we experience it on different terms. We are different beings. We experience the world in different ways. Right? So when we accounted for that, we found that men had experiences that were just a little bit different. And when you accounted for that, rape equalized, just like abuse. It's fairly equal. It's bidirectional, as we call it, in regard to the Black community, most especially. Right? Intimate partner violence is bidirectional. Well, sexual assault and rape is also equalized when you account for the differences in the way men and women may experience it. Right? And there are similarities too. I'm not saying they're wholly different, but they can be. And so when you expand this, you look at the made to penetrate cases, you look at the new FBI definition of rape in 2012, and you add in prison sexual assault and rape statistics, it is my argument that men actually experience rape more than women in this country, by men and women. And the reason is that America incarcerates more of its citizens than any other country in the world. And up to a few years ago, you only had around a couple 100,000 women incarcerated and over 2 million men. So when you factor in the numbers, the offset of rape and sexual assault due to incarceration alone bolstered the numbers for men. But we didn't recognize that because we were told that rape only happens to women. So, as a colleague of mine, Brother Douglas, said on Facebook, if it takes these kind of comic books to bring the issue to the forefront, I'll accept it. while lamenting at the same time our immaturity as a culture to recognize men's vulnerability beyond tropes that we were sold as children watching movies. It is what it is. When you take Batman, who's, arguably the best superhero in comics ever written, and even he can be raped in a fashion where we are completely oblivious to it. It says a lot about us in general. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Check out the Invincible series. Tell me what you think. Peace.